Hello, beautiful alchemist. Happy Monday. Welcome to Reiki Radio. I am your host, Yolanda. And today, of course, we have another incredible conversation with a Reiki practitioner today. Here on the podcast, we talk to practitioners and teachers of all different lineages, systems of practice, and I think we have incredible opportunities to learn from each other and each other's stories. But one of the things I love most about Reiki in particular, it's the community. I really have had such an incredible opportunity of meeting so many people, one through the podcast, of course, but also through Reiki classes and Reiki circles, Reiki shares. Through Reiki, I believe we meet so many wonderful people, we hear amazing stories, and we support each other through the principles of Reiki, very specifically with love and compassion. So today you'll meet one of the friends that I've made through this journey. Her name is Michaela Daystar, and she is the founder of HeartScapes Studio. Now, Michaela and I met many years ago in a Reiki class with our teacher, Frans Stiene. And Michaela focuses a lot on trauma informed Reiki because she really believes that we have an opportunity to practice without unintentional harm. So she's drawn to methods that uncover our innate wisdom and creative nature. And Michaela designs experiences that help individuals and groups connect more deeply with aspects of their identity and purpose, and that transform the barriers to living into that purpose. She also has a particular interest in supporting those who are most directly impacted by racism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression that play in our lives. So, as I mentioned, she does teach the trauma informed Reiki course to ensure that we practice without unintended harm. And you will learn more about that in this conversation. Michaela does hold an MA in social justice leadership from St. Mary's College in California, and she studied Reiki as a Shimpenden graduate with the International House of Reiki. And you can learn more about Michaela and her work at heartscapesinsight.com. She also has a beautiful podcast, and I'm sure that you will love those conversations that she's having over there as well. I actually was recently interviewed on her podcast, so I hope that you'll go and check that out. The name of the show is Reiki, Crossroads, and Connections, and you can find that on YouTube. I will put the link below. So I hope you enjoy this episode, beautiful loves. I will see you on the other side. Okay, everyone. Today we are here with the beautiful Michaela Daystar, a great friend of mine. Thank you, babe, for making time to come and have this conversation today.
Any day, girl. We just get on that train and ride it. So I'm
I
excited.
know. So we have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk a lot about Reiki and I'm sure so much more. But in that vein, I wanted to just share with everyone, in case you didn't see the interview years ago, Michaela has been here before. If we could just start with, my love, your journey with Reiki, and then also chat a little bit about we met each other in a Reiki class
We
several
did.
years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that particular moment is definitely part of the thread of whatever it is that we're going to talk about today. Yeah, I mean, I think like many people, I found Reiki during my own kind of period of crisis, massive change in my life. I'd gone through a pretty difficult period of my marriage at the end of that time, and that marriage had ended, and coming through the other side of a period of time that was very painful and that caused me to really withdraw from myself. It was very humbling to notice when I was on the other side and things felt more stable and calm, how much of myself I'd lost and like numbed over during that time. And so, when you're in that kind of a space, you start looking for guidance and, become, at least for me, I became much more aware and open to things that I didn't, hadn't necessarily tried that weren't my strategies from the past. And, somewhere in and encountered many different practices, each of which had their moment, or many
Yeah.
working with many different practitioners. Um, And, looking back on it, I can kind of see the breadcrumbs that, were followed. But in the time, it really felt like, whoa, everything's just coming in, like, do this, do that, do that. And finding just little, pieces of myself along that journey. And a couple of those practices stayed with me, for the long term. In particular, the practice of soul collage and, of course, the practice of Reiki. And I think because both of those practices, which are very, very different in structure, both hold a similar intention, particularly when we work with Reiki from the perspective that we do from its origins, which is a self practice for, self-exploration, self-knowledge, and for remembering ourselves. And ultimately, that's really what it came down to, was that I needed to remember myself and, perhaps for the first time in my conscious life, right? And really put the pieces together of what that meant, and then therefore what is my contribution to the world. And so those two practices really specifically honed in on that quality. And then what are the conditions that we have to create inside of ourselves for that to be true? Because just knowing that we've lost ourselves, we've forgotten ourselves, there's a wider web of life that we feel disconnected from. Like, the awareness of that is essential and incredibly painful. And then what do we do with it, right? Once we're aware that we're disconnected from ourselves and each other and the world, like, oh, the heartbreak of it. But if we can stay present inside of that deep grief of that realization, and we can stay open, then back to ourselves start becoming clear in our life. And of course, there's many pathways to do this kind of work. And just for me, Reiki and Soul Collage ended up being one of them. And, my first 3 years with Reiki were in a very, what I would now consider traditionally Western form of the practice. And that was an amazing entry point, right? It was really the place where I needed to land. I had a, really great and loving teacher inside of that tradition. And at a certain point, it started to feel dissatisfying. It started to feel a little bit hollow. I started seeking for, something more. And it felt like there was this groundwater that I hadn't quite reached, like my roots were trying to get deep enough to touch it, but hadn't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
I could feel it, but I couldn't touch it. And I started studying more and more kind of out there versions of Western Reiki, more and more complex. And I ended up feeling like I was moving further away and almost gave it up entirely. It became very frustrating. The other piece was that I was starting to feel out of integrity because I was practicing a practice that I knew to have Japanese origins, but clearly learning it in a way that was divorced from those origins. We were learning practices that were not Japanese, but that were being taught as if they were part and parcel of the system. That didn't feel right. And there wasn't anything about those origins that was being explicitly connected and taught and communicated inside of the learning spaces that I was in. There weren't conversations being had about it. What was this practice originally? Where did it come from? What really was the cultural context in which it arose, and what came before, right? Because it's not a very old practice, right? Just over 100 years, kind of an active use in the world. It didn't arise in a vacuum, right? It came from something. What was that something? And, those two feelings of, dissatisfaction with the effectiveness of my practice, and then the integrity of my practice caused me to go back into a space of seeking. And ultimately, ironically, through an animal Reiki class, found the teacher that became my teacher for the next few years that you and I share, Frans Stiene. And that's how you and I came to be in Los Angeles in a beautiful retreat center, chanting and practicing together and remembering our wholeness and our community and becoming friends.
Yes. Okay. So there's two things with what you just shared that I would love for you to touch on again. One, oh, we'll do this one second, but I just want to say it so I don't forget. When I was just thinking about us having this conversation today, like my heart really smiled even at the idea that, that we would stay in touch all of these years, even though we didn't talk like every weekend or whatever it may be, but the community and how in those spaces, in the classes, like you really have a beautiful opportunity to create these connections and friendships that last a very long time.
Yes.
And I want to talk to you about that in community as well. But I want to back up a little bit with what you were saying, like this disconnection from yourself
Mhm.
and even the grief of the realization of feeling that way.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about okay, so you recognize like maybe there was a sense of emptiness or whatever it is you were feeling. When you started seeking, what was it like to start picking up the pieces to like re-identify or to remember or to realize, like, was it just exciting or was that hard too?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was hard for sure and exciting. And, I mean, I think many of us have had a moment like that where we become aware that there's a destination that we need to seek.
Yeah.
And the conditions of our life, will be different. In that moment, again, I had gone through about a 6-year period of my life that was incredibly painful and incredibly constricting. And, to be perfectly honest, in the context of an abusive marriage,
Mm,
and one that made me get as small as I could get,
mm,
and contract. And as I said before, kind of numb out to just kind of get through. For a long time thinking, well, this will get better. This, it hasn't been like this forever. It won't be like this forever.
mhm.
And at a certain point, that wasn't going to be the case. Did the hard things, transitioned that process. So on the other side of that, there was a great sense of relief that was present. It took 6 years in part, 3 years of that was planning and figuring out how I was going to be an adult outside of this relationship because we'd been together since I was 16.
Wow.
I didn't know how to be an adult outside of this relationship. So there was a lot of like planning and logistics and how will I fill the blanks and how will this all work?
Mm,
We have 2 kids. We had a tiny baby. Like, there's just a lot. And so it was really, really hard that time. And on the other side of that, there was great relief and also fear and also the unknown. But I think because of the juxtaposition of the relief and the release of pain and like acute, crisis almost all the time, alongside of the fear and the like, oh shit, what's going to happen now? That created an interesting set of conditions inside, that I think did cause me to feel incredibly open to following signs, following intuition. One of the first things that I really had to wrestle with was the fact that I had suppressed my intuition a great deal. You and I were just talking about, working with intuition in explicit ways. And, the reason is because I realized that my intuition obviously had been telling me, make a different choice, take a different
right.
path, do a hard thing, and I wasn't ready for a long, long time. So when you suppress those voices of knowing inside of yourself and the ways that your body and your mind, your heart, guide you, a couple of things happen. One, those voices get real quiet, at least in the language that they naturally speak to you in. But what gets really, really loud is dis-ease in the body and in the mind and in the heart, right?
Yeah.
The voice of our intuition can get real, real painful when we suppress it, and really muddy and hard to understand. So realizing that that had happened was really powerful. And one of the first, healing sessions that I went to with a shamanic practitioner that I worked with for a long time, she asked, "What's your intention for the session?" And I had whatever intention that I was, but when I opened my mouth, what came out is I need to rebuild my intuition. And I was
Mm.
like, "What did I just say? Okay, I guess that's what we're here for."
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I think in answer to your question, it was very hard, but it was also very exciting, and it was in the context of a sense of spaciousness inside of me that I had not ever felt in that way, and certainly had not felt for a very long time.
Yeah.
And that was buoying, and it gave me energy for the seeking.
It's so interesting, because we've talked over the years, but I didn't know this much about what you had gone through. And similarly, that's what the beginning of this journey was like for me as well. Like it was incredible in so many ways, but it was also one of the hardest things to go through. And I think that's important for a lot of people to hear because they may expect that it's only supposed to be so freeing and, just feel so good, but it can be very, very hard, the layers of recognizing what you hold and how you are perceiving, and then even finding it in you to not judge yourself and on and on and on, right? But then you find Reiki and you're practicing, I assume, even just knowing you, you're practicing. But it's interesting to me too that something in you still knew there's more for me to understand about the system. So I wanted to know what that was like for you, even prior to finding the more traditional. What was it like while you were practicing? What was coming up? Like, what was your experience in starting to initiate that relationship to Reiki?
Originally, it was very externally focused.
Yeah.
Prior to finding Reiki, as I said, I had been seeking and working, and the first thing that I found to start, I mean, what you might call the healing journey,
Yeah.
which is a term that can get kind of generic, but it also can have great meaning for
Right.
those, when you actually think about what it means in your life. The first thing I did was spend a year in Codependence Anonymous, like do walking through the steps, like 12 step in my way into self-awareness because I was just so blind to myself. I was so blind to the ways that I was contributing to my own suffering, the ways that I was giving over my power, the ways that I was causing more suffering for my family, including my ex-husband, by coping with this situation in really unhealthy ways. And so I had, been through this kind of initiation of self-awareness, which seems kind of funny to say now, but like, how often are we just not aware of what is happening in here,
Right.
and we're just acting and reacting from whatever feelings are running behind in the subconscious. And so and then going through shamanic work and working with soul collage for several years, well, by the time I found Reiki, this is the point I'm trying to get to. By the time I found Reiki, there was a certain part of me that kind of naively and arrogantly felt like I kind of had it figured out. Like, okay, I did it. I got through the journey. I'm transformed. I'm ready to be of service, right? Like I'm ready to take this and share it out with the world. And of course, the way that Western Reiki is presented, there's a lot of opportunity to view it as an external practice, right? A good teacher will, of course, invite us to work with ourselves first and foremost, and many teachers do. And my teacher did. She definitely encouraged self-practice as the foundation of the system of Reiki. But the practice was definitely framed as this is a healing modality to share with other people. And that felt great for me because now I can go be a good person and I can go heal other people. And, there was a kind of an ego in that and because, codependence, it's sneaky, right? It's like once it's your way of being, like if it's been your way of being for decades, right? Most of your life, you don't just unlearn it in a year. Like whatever our old programming is, it's there. And so there was this piece of me that was like, if I can make other people feel okay, then I'll feel okay. If I can make other people feel healed, then I'll feel healed. If they're in a good place, I get to be in a good place, right? Their positive outlook is what's required for my positive outlook. And so let me do this practice where the people around me can get this kind of healing, and therefore I will be okay. I wasn't aware that that was the script I was running, but it was. And so that felt really good, for a period of time. And, it worked. That was a good thing to do. And I think that what happened over time when that dissatisfaction started to creep in was, it was related to coming to a greater awareness of that dynamic.
Yeah.
Because, continuing to work with soul collage, continuing to work with other practices that were much more explicitly self-reflective, caused me to see that pattern. And the ways that I was, often almost like making things up to tell people like, oh, this session was like this, and here's the message I got for you. And just like trying to spin this whole like web of value that I could give to other people. And I'm like, what is that? Like, why do I feel so desperately that I have to like fix them? like, and solve their problem and give them their magic solution and,
Yeah.
just the right thing, right? And it's like, oh, because I want to get recognized for that,
Mm.
right? And I want to feel like I'm okay because they're okay. And I think that kind of psychological awareness and self-reflection just added on to that sense of a lack of integrity with not understanding the origins of the practice, not doing my own work to seek out those origins. I wasn't doing any work to find it,
Yeah.
And also this kind of more the spiritual awareness, because despite the external facing way that I was going about it, of course, being in Reiki is still working on you on the internal places. And so there was a deeper activity that was developing. It wasn't developing as effectively or as powerfully as it would later, but it was developing. And so there was also this, like I described before, this sense of a deeper groundwater that my roots hadn't quite hit yet. And all of those things kind of came together in this, almost like crescendo of frustration, or I was like, I thought I had the path. I thought I knew what I was doing, and now I don't know what I'm doing anymore.
Yeah.
Little bit of a crisis of faith, perhaps. Luckily, it didn't last long.
That is wild. So, a couple of things again, like listening to you tell your story, you remind me of what a lot of us probably can recognize in ourselves. The whole thing of, I'll be okay if you're okay, even just at base level, like not in the realm of we're consciously working on ourselves. I think of how much we do that just all throughout life. Like if your friend calls you and they're upset, a lot of times we want to fix it because them not being okay makes us so uncomfortable.
Right.
And also, I think it's a big piece that you point out, that recognition of, I got to help. I was the one I got to fix, right? Yeah, it's so interesting when we can zoom out and see really what is my motivation or what is driving me to respond and react in the ways that I do. But you've mentioned soul collage a couple of times, so I can't not ask you about this because I really, I would love for you to tell us what it is, but also how that medium
Mhm.
also plays another part in what you were holding
Yeah.
or exposing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to kind of draw the connections with Reiki too, because like I said, I think these two practices, as different as they are, very explicitly point to the same place, the same outcome. So just grab a stack of cards here since we're talking about it. You and I share a love of Oracle, and both have had the experience of creating oracles
Yes.
very differently. Mine through the practice of soul collage. So soul collage is a practice of drawing on our intuition, our imagination, and found images to create basically miniature collages, small collages that represent different aspects of ourself. So the idea that we are each a single sovereign being, and inside of us are many, many, many parts, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. Those parts all, govern different aspects of our experience that come out of, they're created out of different parts of our experience.
Mhm.
And they create our subconscious. The woman who created this system of practice, Sina Frost, she was a Jungian psychologist. So for anybody who has studied any of Carl Jung's work, you might feel kind of threads of that. It's very explicitly tied to it. The idea that our subconscious is vast, and it is indeed what is driving our behavior, our actions, our beliefs to a huge extent. And while we might never know the incredible vastness of it, maybe that's a characteristic of enlightenment. You know yourself completely, right? Most of us won't, but that's okay. There's plenty of room for mystery. But the more that we can give form and voice to the parts of ourself that are kind of driving the show without our awareness, the more whole, first of all, the more sense of our wholeness we have, and the more control we have over our feelings and our actions.
Mhm.
And so it's an incredibly clever and delightful way of doing that. So just to give you a visual, this is the size of the cards that we make. They're 5 by 8 inches. That gives you enough room to make, as much collaging as you need to make, but it's small enough to serve two functions. One, to really encourage us to focus on one aspect of ourself at a time, as much as we can, and then also to put it in a format that can function as an oracle deck. So you end up with what I call the Oracle of You. How many parts of you are there, right? Endless, potentially. I have probably 200 cards in my deck right now, and
Wow.
could probably rattle off 50 other parts that probably should have a card that don't yet, right? But they come out directly out of our experiences, and the process allows us to open ourselves to what most needs to speak to us in that moment, right? What part of ourself just really needs to have a chat with us in this moment,
Yeah.
has something to say, has a need that isn't being fulfilled, is causing trouble in our life in a certain way, or is trying to inspire us and fuel us and nourish us in a particular way. So there's certainly a lot of shadow work that gets done, and in a way that is so tender because it allows us to be to fall in love with those parts of ourselves that we've exiled, to see how desperately they're trying to keep us safe and how much they love us, even if we've exiled them. And it's an opportunity to find the parts of ourself that are really fueling our goodness and our contribution to the world, and to let them be in dialogue with each other and with us. And so, inside of that, right, if we return to the themes of Reiki, that we are here to remember the wholeness of our true self, to live a life that is grounded, that is spacious, that's connected, to embody the precepts in our life. You can probably see how a practice like this supports that process, certainly in the remembering ourself part, but also certainly in finding those places of grounding, those places of spaciousness, and those places of connection that already exist inside of us, but that we can lose track of in our life.
Wow. I want to just describe kind of what I just saw for people who may be listening on the podcast platform and ask you a bit about it, because even with what you just said, it sounds like what a beautiful way of being able to acknowledge honestly and being vulnerable with ourselves, even if you don't want to speak it directly, whatever it is that you may be carrying, but to still allow it to move, to be seen, to be acknowledged, and both sides of the fence, whether we consider it light or dark, just that you're giving it acknowledgement. It sounds really beautiful. So one of those images you held up, it looked like a rabbit with wings. Is that? Yeah. That is, oh, and there's a bunch of smaller
Tiny
rabbits.
rabbits, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Want to know who this is?
I do. And I want to ask you, when you initially create it, whatever's coming through you at that time, say like a year from now, you look at the same image, is it very similar to Oracle in that it could have a bunch of different meanings for you, even though it came from something specific?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way that you talk about within Oracle practice, building a relationship with your deck.
Yeah.
And any meaningful relationship takes time, and it's going to evolve, and you're going to see different aspects of it, and the other object of that relationship, subject of that relationship, you're going to see different aspects of them. So, within the practice of soul collage, there's three parts essentially. There's the making of the card. There's the initial reading of the card. There's a really beautiful ritual called I am one who, for allowing the card to introduce itself to you, to that part of you to say, I am one who, and then describe themselves. Here's why I'm here. Here's what's on my mind. Here's my gift in your life. Here's the question that I have. Here's what I need. And then there's working with the cards over time. And all of these steps are valuable. You could make the card, just have that one experience and then move on, and it's still valuable. But of course, the deeper value is in building the relationship over time.
Yes.
And so, working with it very much like you would any other Oracle deck or Tarot, but knowing that 100% of the meaning is coming from inside of you, of course, in collaboration with everything that touches you from the outside, but you're making your own meaning. And so that meaning is incredibly fluid. There are cards in my deck that I don't really know who they are yet. I just kind of flashed through this one.
Wow.
And I had a particular thing in mind when I made it. I'm not remembering like at this moment, but it's still very mysterious. Like I don't quite know who it is yet. It hasn't come up in readings yet. But when I have a card like that, it's good to just spend some time with it and let it, reveal itself over time. And so, but many of the cards are very, like their identity is very clear. Like, for example, that rabbit, this is my sacrificing mother. This is the aspect of my identity as a mom that sacrifices for my children. And then is also, extended into, when one sacrifices in any kind of context. And that can have challenging and beautiful aspects of it, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes we can over sacrifice. That's an element of codependence. So this one is related to that aspect of myself. And so giving it form allows me to remember the beauty of sacrificing, for those who are dependent on me or those who are in community, but to watch the boundaries of where it tips into, over giving or giving for those reasons I discussed earlier because of
Yeah.
needing the security. And the word for these that Sina Frost used, and I know that you'll appreciate this because of your deep connection with Egyptian culture, the word she used was netters. And netter being a word, I don't know the exact translation, but a word referring to those many aspects of God and the idea of the one inside of the many and the many inside of the one, and the way that the divine is expressed in all of these different faces and voices, and then applying that to us. We also are expressed with many different voices. And so each one of these cards is called a netter, and that helps us to remember that framework of the many parts of our one self and that we are one part of a many faceted spiritual community.
With that, you remind me of, because some people refer to the deities as netters for that exact same reason,
Definitely.
but even how in so many traditions we talk about the many faces of the goddess, or the goddess with 10,000 names and all of these different things. But what else is interesting about you and your story, I have to say, and I'm sure again, this a lot of people will be able to relate to this. So you were, whatever the catalyst was, now you are finding teachings and practices and things that are helping you to see you again, to acknowledge you again in a very deep way. And then, even though initially, just out of pattern and habit, there was something where you're like, okay, now I want to take this and I want to help other people, right? And I could be wrong, but I'm going to say I believe we probably have this in common, because I did the same. And then at some point something like smacked me like, girl, you you have a lot you need to still look at, right? And it was like, oh, right. Yeah, okay. But in that, you I want to get to how you got to the trauma informed Reiki, which is a very big part of your work. But I'm very curious of what started to, before that was clear, what started to stir in you the recognition of like why this was important and what you were experiencing in your journey of healing, and perhaps even going to classes. Like, what was the experience that made this a thing?
Yeah. Yeah, the trauma-informed Reiki work came out of kind of the nexus of a variety of things, certainly personal experiences and then other aspects of my career that have been important. And one of, if we kind of shift the lens a little bit from, our personal practice, right? Because you and I share a deep personal practice, and the really coming back to that truth that Reiki is a self-practice first and foremost. And then because of the strength of that practice, we can share with others. And, as I said, I had to kind of back my way into that because it did start as an external thing. And I'm like, oh, maybe this could be my job. Um, but, but it did ultimately become my job.
Yeah.
And, whole other side of the story, but just to kind of summarize, I worked in university settings for about 15 years, still do on a consulting basis from time to time. It's a deep love of mine to work with students. And, in that capacity was focused primarily on leadership development within social justice realms, and very, very externally focused, right? All about like, let's train up the next generation to go out and make a difference and do this work. Very doing oriented, skills building, capacity building, connecting with mentors and so on.
Yeah.
And that was amazing, and it's very much aligned with my values and my beliefs and how I want to be in the world. But there are things about the job that didn't align well with my skill sets, so that's one thing. But on a level of values, right, I was seeing the ways in which students were coming into this work by and large from a traumatized place.
Mm.
They wanted to make the world a better place. They wanted to shift systems of oppression because they'd been hurt by them, or they'd seen people hurt by them, people they cared about. Most of the students I was working with were coming in with some kind of deep wounding. And the answer to that, and of course they had their own journeys with how they were addressing that for themselves. I don't want to suggest that nobody was working on their internal stuff. Of course, there's a wide range, but for the most part, I was working with pretty young people who weren't necessarily at a point in their life where they kind of started that process. And what they knew they could do was to apply their education and ultimately their job to filling this wound in the world, right? And in our position in the university, at least the position I was holding, we had no way of addressing that wound directly. It just wasn't our place. It wasn't the work we were there to do. But I could see it, and I could see the way it was impacting their outlook, their sense of possibility, their sense of themselves. They were hyper fixated on the problems and very, very pressed to actually even imagine solutions. How can we make change in the world if we can't imagine a different world?
Right.
But how can we imagine a different world if we're so constricted around the places where the world has hurt us? And I could see that in the dynamics that were happening. And I could feel the need for that piece to be addressed. And I had no capacity to address it, both because of the structure of my job and because I didn't have the skills. Like, I didn't know how. And I did, once I found soul collage, I did start bringing that in. I did start taking risks to do more creative processes. We did some practices around imagining the world free from this problem that you're focused on. I have a beautiful art piece, a beautiful broadside that the printing department, we had a handmade book arts program at the college I worked on, and took these little short poems that the students wrote that described the world free from whatever problem they were working on, and they made it into a beautiful broadside that I have framed. Wow. So we had these little moments, right? But I knew that I needed to shift my work to be more explicitly working with that. So professionally, that's part of what led me to want to do the work I do now. But once I was working with Reiki, then it felt like there was these two separate worlds. Like there's this juicy internal healing space, and then there's this like going in the world and making it a better place space. And I thought that they were going to kind of merge together more seamlessly in my work, but logistically, I didn't know how to make that happen. And so a big part of my journey as a business owner, a Reiki business person specifically, over the past almost 10 years, has been little by little pulling those threads from that place and tying them together with this place, because that is what my purpose is to pull, the awareness and the connection to the work that needs to be done in the world with the process of creating the conditions inside of ourselves for that world to actually take root and to bear fruit inside of us. And it took longer. I mean, it's still ongoing. I still will make tweaks to my website to be more explicit about this. Like, oh, I'm not actually saying it directly. There's still so many ways to pull that together. But bringing it back to your question, one of the ways that became very explicit was noticing that within our community of Reiki, and I think this is true in many kind of healing spaces, there can be, not for everybody and not in every space, but there can be a quality of retreating into these spaces, feeling how big and challenging the world is and being like, I'm not dealing with that shit. I'm coming in here to this juicy place. I'm coming into this beautiful place. I'm going to ascend away from all of that. I'm going to remove myself from it. I'm going to dissociate from it. And in some instances, that is itself a trauma response. Right? I need to remove myself from the intensity of this world that we live in. And I'm going to do that through spirituality. Mm-hmm. And the term spiritual bypassing kind of can come out of that. The idea of bypassing reality, trying to get around it, not addressing it, not being honest about it inside of ourselves and amongst each other using spiritual processes. And so I was seeing that happening. And one of the explicit ways I was seeing that happening was a certain thread of conversation that would kind of crop up again and again in different spaces around the idea that Reiki can cause no harm, And so anything that happens in a Reiki session, anything that happens in a Reiki space, if you've been attuned to Reiki, you have been rendered impossible to cause harm. By virtue of the attunement process, you are now incapable of causing harm. So anything that happens in a Reiki space you are facilitating is a harm-free zone. So if somebody has a bad experience because of something you did, that's not what you did. That's meant that they're supposed to have that bad experience for their healing journey. And so we got to just help them see that it's all part of the process. And I call bullshit on that because Reiki as an energy, as a phenomenon in the world, it is what we are. It's not causing harm. It is life.
Right.
It is. But Reiki as a system of practice, a system of actions that are enacted by people with other people, there's always the possibility for us to unintentionally harm each other or intentionally, but let's stick with the unintentional, right?
Right,
Let's stick
right.
with the vast majority of us who have incredibly good intentions and deep desire to help, right? That's who I'm talking about.
Right.
And who might not kind of have an awareness that there are things that we might do in the normal course of our Reiki sessions or our classes or just in our life that could feel very frightening to other people because of their experiences. And so, luckily, there is a lens through which we can look at our work that helps us to become more sensitive of that, become more aware of that, and to create systems and practices inside of our business that helps to balance that. And it's called being trauma informed. It's not a perfect process, but it is, and it's a relatively new way of looking at work. But it's incredibly valuable to work with it as it evolves and gets stronger. And I started seeing that more explicitly in yoga communities. Yoga, if we look at kind of the sphere of holistic healing, the realm of yoga really got on board with this early on. And, for obvious reasons, they're working with the body, right? And working with somebody's physical body and touching somebody's body and making adjustment, coming up behind a person who's bent over in a yoga position, coming up behind them and touching their body, right? Can be an incredibly traumatic experience for people who are carrying around certain memories. And so there's been great work done in the realm of yoga, more recently in the realm of mindfulness, meditation, and in other realms like this that psychology is kind of applied to. But I wasn't seeing that inside of the world of Reiki. I was seeing people kind of trying to adapt what was happening in other fields here and there, but without any guidance or structure. So it just seemed like a need that we had. And I knew that because I had had experiences early on, especially in my Reiki practice, where I had done something, there's 3 specific instances where I had done something that I thought was going to be beneficial in a Reiki session that I just kind of riffed off of and hadn't gotten the person's permission, that caused great harm for them, that triggered deep fear in their body, and was a real problem. And then I've had experiences where people have done things in a Reiki session that hadn't necessarily harmed me, but that I can see, like, if somebody had had a certain experience in their background, this thing that I just experienced would be terrifying.
Yeah.
So it's a need, and I just felt that it was a need that I could fill because of my experience in other realms. And so, yeah, so I did. I created curriculum around that and a course.
Well, I want to get more into that because I want to talk about some of the ways that practitioners may not realize, because someone might think like, oh, it's a laying of hands. That's what we do in Reiki. And so I love what you're saying because a lot of times we think our intention is enough and we're
Yes.
showing up and we are meaning to be in a space of love and compassion, but that really doesn't say what someone else's experiences were or will be, or yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about clarifying this, some simple things we can look at, but also let everyone know because they can learn this. They can take a trauma informed Reiki course from you. So before we get into that, there's something else, though, I have to ask you about this whole transition of yours. So, one of the things I'm so curious about in this, and why I'm so glad you're mentioning about the trauma informed, is because it really was your journey of healing and being in relationship with you, with classes, with even wanting to support others, that illuminated for you kind of your authentic position within this work. And so I want to ask you about this because, to your point, a lot of times we come out of Reiki classes, and if we have the intent or feel called to help and support people, it's usually this blueprint that we think we're supposed to mimic. Like, this is what Reiki practitioners do, but we haven't yet necessarily gone through the unlayering that will reveal to us our relationship to energy, our relationship to ourselves, and that thing that kind of lights up of this is what I authentically want to support people with and how. And it sounds like your journey really kind of led you there. So I wanted to ask you about that before you give us more detail on the trauma informed side. Was that what happened for you in a way? Like, were you wanting to support people, but the awareness of how, did it just open up over time?
I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to, so I have now had two solidly different career paths.
Yes.
One of them, I, went to college and studied particular things and, learned particular frameworks, made decisions about, therefore, what I wanted to do. And that changed. I originally was going to be an art history professor, and that never happened. But, by the time I had graduated my undergraduate career, I had a sense of what I wanted my career path to be, and it was in this realm of social justice leadership development.
Mhm.
And there was a clarity to that, right? I didn't know exactly where that was going to go, but there was like, this is the thing that I'm doing. This is the outcome that I want to help with. Okay, so where can I do that? Who can I do that with? What's the what?
Yeah.
What am I going to do? With this path, this came out of my own personal experience, right? So it wasn't a path that was like, let me go to school to learn a thing. It was like, I am in crisis in my life and I need to get my life together over here. And then as I get my life together, we have these experiences. We're like, wow, I could share that, and I did have teaching and mentoring experience from my university job. So it's like, wow, what if I brought these things together? So I think that, your question of did it evolve over time? Yes, it was very fluid and very evolutionary in a way that my original career path was a little bit more intentional. Like, okay, I'm going to take these classes so that I can do this, so that I can do this. Much more of a, revealing over time, like following impulses, following threads, like, feeling called to share it out and then sharing out and then fumbling and I don't know what I'm doing and what is this and I don't know how to run a business and blah, 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 blah. There's a lot more like, where is this leading? At least at first, like
Right.
at this point in the journey, there's much more structure and intention, thank goodness. But yeah, I think just in answer to your question, yes, it was very much kind of being revealed over time and making mistakes and making course corrections and kind of fumbling it out a little
Yeah.
bit.
Because I think it is very interesting in this. Well, one, I would have never thought working with strangers, period. I would have never imagined that not only I wouldn't want to do, I would have never imagined that I would or could, and working in a corporate environment, even that I hated when my boss would have me facilitate meetings. I mean, I would just, oh, just the thought of having to speak in a room full of people and yeah, but it was working energy work, working with Reiki, meditation, all of these things. I started to discover parts of myself that I had misunderstood. I literally had mislabeled myself. I had misidentified myself. I had taken on labels and projections and just ran with them. I mean, just so many things. And all of that is wild. But after like the unlayering and the reclaiming and all of this, it's the only reason I could be sitting here with you hosting a podcast right now, right? So it's amazing to me what people really do start to discover about themselves and what they're capable of. And even for you, like the merging really of something that was always a part of you, always there, It just looked a little less traditional than the trajectory that you were initially on, right? So I want to bring it back to the trauma informed Reiki and giving a few examples for people of what that, why this is important, and some things we may do unintentionally to cause harm that people just don't necessarily realize.
Yeah. Um, would it be okay if I just kind of side quest one more piece that you just
Yes.
sparked, right? 'Cause
Yes.
there's always so many things. We're going to put a pin in the like, practically speaking, how do we not be trauma instigating? But one thing I just want to say again, kind of on this thread of like, for anybody listening who might be in a career trajectory, challenge or struggle or fluid place, or even just for our own reflection on our career journey. There was sometimes certain resources will come in at just the right moment, like this book or this teacher, this whatever, like messages, right? And so in the midst of this really, really confusing jumble, when I was feeling like I needed to change my job, but I didn't know what that was supposed to be, and I was very dissatisfied in my work, I came upon the book called Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. I actually did a book club with it through a church that I'm connected to. And it's about finding your true vocation. And I recommend this book to everybody because it's beautiful, but particularly for people who are wanting to understand their vocation. And vocation as something bigger than our job, right? Like that idea of, where our passion and our capacity meets the world's need, like that place. And, in this book, Parker Palmer, who's an author and a teacher, and many other things, has a really fascinating personal history, walks us through his journey to understanding his true vocation and, going through lots of depression and all the things and experimenting to kind of land there. And the message that I wanted to speak here in this context is, this point of reflection that we do need to have walked our journey for a period of time to be able to take the pause and kind of reflect back. And he talked about and then recommended to us looking for threads of commonality between all of the things that we've done, right? We've probably done lots of things, this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. Is there a thread that connects them? And as he was talking about this, for him, what came clear was teaching was always the thread, and writing. Maybe more specifically writing, but kind of those two, like writing in an educational way, were the threads that, whatever it was he was doing, the reason he was doing it was because he wanted to write about it and teach about it. Mm-hmm. And it didn't, like, that stuck in my mind, but it was years later that it was like, oh, my thread is teaching. It's always teaching. Back to when I was a high schooler, I was teaching people how to draw, and I was teaching people how to make friendship bracelets. And I was like, there's always this like thread of teaching. And at the university, the times I felt most lit up was when I was teaching, when I was in some sort of educating or mentoring capacity. And in my Reiki practice, I love doing sessions with people, but really what lights me up is teaching. That's why I have a YouTube channel, because I can just teach whatever I want to on a given day. So I think that's the piece I want to just kind of close this loop around vocation that has come up in this conversation, is to look for those threads of commonality. What is the thing that always lights you up no matter what it is that you're doing? That's the thing that's at the heart of whatever you're meant to be doing. So with that, part of how that has gotten expressed for me is in teaching on this subject of trauma-informed Reiki, so we can bring it back to the pin. So I think that the place to start and to kind of be concise and, in the time that we have here, is that really what being trauma-informed is a series of awarenesses, mindsets that we cultivate from that awareness, and then therefore practices and protocols that we operationalize in our business. And most specifically, this is for anybody who's actively working with other people in Reiki. With our own self-practice, there's a different set of considerations on how to like hold the right kind of space for ourselves. Of course, they're related, because probably we're working through our own points of trauma through our practice, whether or not we use that word. I think that word, like on the one hand, can be kind of scary. It can feel really intense. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, it is becoming a bit of a buzzword in society. for good, which is good, right? It means there's conversation. But, really what I'm talking about when I say trauma is the moments in our life where we've experienced something that was deeply frightening, deeply confusing, that caused harm in some way, and that we couldn't escape from. Our system is designed to recover from harm, to recover from frightening experiences, from life coming at us fast and hard. Our system is designed to flood us with the hormones that we need to deal with that situation, and then to digest those hormones so that they're clear from our system. And it's not a perfect system. It can get interrupted. And it gets interrupted when, for a lot of reasons, but when we can't complete that process for some reason. Lots of different reasons why that could be. And this is a super common thing to happen, right? It's like it's something to normalize that, like, all of us have got some little bit of something, right? Again, back to soul collage, that whole vast realm of the subconscious that is driving our behaviors and our beliefs and our actions from these experiences that we've had in our life. And culturally speaking, many of us come from people who had a greater sensitivity to energetically and spiritually clearing those places, right? In modern society, we look at it more from medical perspectives, right? Heal whatever physical harm might have been done, and from psychological perspectives, right? Heal the therapeutic places. More and more, we're starting to understand the somatic, right? The way in which our body can hold things in ways that are not about physical healing, and the spiritual aspect. When I first started learning about shamanic journeying, and just kind of a shamanic perspective, which is of course, a generic term to just refer to indigenous healing practices that all of us, if we go back far enough, we have some version of that's culturally specific to where we come from. But there's much more of an awareness that when something traumatic happens, there's this spiritual imprint that needs to be cleared, and that would be tended to in the moment, and in the aftermath. And we just don't have that by and large, culturally speaking, right?
Right.
So I'm right, girl. Cut me off anytime.
No. This is
I'll talk.
good.
I'll
This is
just talk.
good.
But so all of that is to say, if we're working with the public, we have a Reiki practice, we have clients who come to see us, we can assume, we can normalize that most people have got something in their background that might cause them to feel unsafe, untrustworthy, unsettled, or to have those feelings arise spontaneously because of something they experience. We cannot and are not expected to know what all of those things are.
Right.
That's not what this is about. We cannot account for everything that's going to trigger a traumatic response for somebody else. And each of us, as part of our self-responsibility in our journey, if we are aware that we are carrying such a thing, it is part of our responsibility to do that work, to work with it, right? So that we are less, reactive to the world, right? Because that can cause us and others lots of trouble. But as a person who's holding a healing space, we have an additional layer of responsibility to tend to this fact that people are going to be carrying things in. We can't know, we're not expected to know what all of them are. However, we can understand some of the patterns that are present. And we can create our space in a way that accounts for those patterns. And those patterns I would summarize as saying, traumatic experiences make us feel unsafe, they make us feel out of control, and they make us feel trapped in the past. And so we can create spaces that give back control to our clients in specific ways, that in more ways than maybe even we can imagine, offer them opportunity to grant consent to what they experience so that they can feel their system, right? Not just their mind, because they've come to your Reiki session. They've consented to be there. They've consented to do whatever it is that you want to do in a general way.
Right.
But in a more refined way, have we asked them consent to touch their body? Even if that's presumed to be part of a Reiki session.
Right.
There's something that happens with our nervous system when we are asked and we give consent. It signals to those subconscious places, okay, we're okay. Stand down,
Yeah.
you can calm it down a little bit, And these are things that we can normalize because they're good for all of us. Whether or not a person is going to feel unsafe by physical touch, which most people don't. Most people are there because they want that. Mm-hmm. Even if we're not going to feel unsafe, the act of being asked permission to be touched, and to give that permission is inherently connection building. It's good for all of us, right? So that's a very obvious place where we spend time looking at trauma informed. But then we look at the many layers, right? What are some of the other patterns that show up in people's experience that we might take as a given that they're going to be positive, right? I love using drums, for example. I've learned not to take it for granted that somebody will feel safe all of a sudden hearing a drum beat coming in. So I ask their permission.
Right.
I like using scented oils from time to time. I've learned not to assume that the scent of cedar, which is very enlivening and healing for me, is going to feel good for somebody else, right? Scents like cedar, like pine, are used in a lot of products that people put on their bodies, which means that people can have negative associations with those
Right.
scents. I don't assume that everything that I like to have visually in my space is going to feel good for everybody. So there's ways that we can consciously design our space and design the arc of the experience that we lead people through to identify the things that are essential for us, because ultimately it is our practice. We get to decide what is included in our session,
Right.
and what becomes optional or not. But we need to communicate that to people so they can understand what to expect. And there are certain things like physical touch, like scent, which can also just have medical repercussions for people who are chemically sensitive, whether or not they feel afraid or traumatized. They might get a splitting headache if I just
Right.
put some oil under their nose, right? So, that's really what it's about, shifting this mindset to curiosity and openness, like, I wonder how other people are experiencing this, and how can I inform them and invite them into having a sense of power in this space? Because ultimately, they are the expert of their own experience.
Right.
We bring expertise, we bring experience, we bring experiences we can share to them. But we are not the expert of their internal landscape. They are.
Mhm.
The healing that's going to happen for them, if any of it does, is going to come from inside of them. It's not coming from us, right? Even that mindset, which is not the mindset I used to hold, right? I was originally taught that what we're doing is we're healing people.
Yeah.
We're sending healing energy to them. We're channeling healing energy to them to cause a healing response in them. I don't believe that anymore. And so I communicate that to my clients. I say, I'm here to hold a space for your system to do the healing work that it is already doing on your behalf and that it knows exactly how to do. I'm here to create conditions for that to happen in a way that's optimized for you,
Yeah.
and to hold a space that feels supportive and relaxing and beautiful. That's my role here. Your role here is to do whatever healing you're ready to do. And when I tell people that, their posture shifts, their
Yeah.
face shifts. They take ownership of their process in a way that they weren't expecting. Some people are disappointed because they want me to fix their problems,
Yes.
right? That's okay. We can
Yep.
talk about it. And maybe, there's been a couple of times, maybe two or three at the most, because for the most part, this is an empowering message. But for a couple of people, it's been a disappointment and they were not the right clients for me. And that's okay. It's okay. There's other folks who can
You're
serve them
saying
well.
so many good nuggets here that I'm so glad practitioners are getting to hear. No, really, truly. So one of the things I will add to your list of scents is also, I always tell people you got to be mindful of like smudging. Like not
Yes,
everybody likes sage or Palo Santo as much as we
right.
think you got to ask. But with what you just said, on one hand, I'm like, that is so empowering for clients to know that they are also a part of and responsible to their own healing and what they allow themselves to be more open to receiving. However, it can take a lot of pressure off of practitioners too, of thinking they have to fix. But I
Right.
love exactly what you just said, that it also highlights it is not my job to fix. As a practitioner, that is not our job. And
Right.
I think that's a great way of educating your clients as well, so
Yes.
that there's not that expectation on either side of the fence.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said something earlier about intention versus impact. right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is related to this piece, but it also is just something that's really worth highlighting because this was something that I explicitly carried from that work in social justice realms. We had to work a lot with that idea of intention versus impact because a lot of times people will be acting with very good intentions. I
Right.
want the best for somebody, or I'm doing this because I think it's good. And in social justice circles, we had to really, you know, make that distinction that we might be acting in a way that we intend to be good, but the impact of that action, because we don't know everything, or maybe we've overlooked something, or we've made a mistake, or we have a blind spot, or we have a prejudice, might be causing an impact for other people that's harmful and probably what we don't want to be happening. As a way to really bring subtlety to movement building, because a lot of people will act with good intentions in ways that cause harm. And we can get very defensive around that. But
Right.
my intentions were good. I didn't mean to hurt you. Can't you see that I meant the best? So therefore, can't you just receive the best because that's what I meant? And then over here, it's like, but I was hurt.
Right.
I got hurt. So your intentions, maybe they don't mean shit, right? And
Yeah.
we can find that middle ground where it's like the intentions do matter. It matters that I don't want to hurt you.
Right. Right.
Because if I wanted to hurt you, it would be a different kind of conversation. It would be a different relationship.
Right.
It matters that I don't want to hurt you,
Mhm.
right? But if I do, then I need to hear that. I
Yeah.
need to receive that from you, and I need to not tell you, but I meant well.
Yeah.
Can't that be good enough?
Right.
Right? And so I would see that dynamic happening in this conversation around, but Reiki can cause no harm. And so therefore, if somebody's reporting harm, well, my intentions were good. I'm attuned to Reiki. Reiki can cause no harm. So you're mistaken. You're mistaken. You weren't harmed. You had an experience on your healing journey that you probably need to figure out. And it's an unskillful and it's an unkind message. And it's one that we can easily undo. And here's part of the good news. I promise you, practitioners out there, you will feel more empowered as a practitioner when you operate this way.
Mhm.
You will feel like your feet are on more solid ground. You will feel in greater integrity and you will feel more connection to your clients.
Yeah, and everything you shared too, I mean, it really highlights the beauty of the intention, but really the ability to create safe feeling, healing environments, and really having that more of the understanding that this is an environment for healing, and that includes what the other person's experience is, what the client's experience is. I mean, how could we create a healing environment without some level of input, as you say, like just even simply permission to touch or permission for which other elements we may or may not use within the session. But another thing you bring up, Michaela, that is, I think, so beautiful is when we do take this approach and we don't personalize and we don't put this weight on ourselves that we're supposed to fix everything for everyone, we really get to learn how much multifaceted healing is and how that in of itself has so many faces, which is why a lot of these deities that we hear about from all different cultures, there are um, so many. But again, a lot of them represent the many faces of, as you say, like it represents the many faces of God, which represents the many faces of us, which is going to boil down to, again, the many faces of our healing. It's not what worked for Bob isn't going to work for Jill in your sessions necessarily. God, I feel like practitioners are going to have a lot to think about after this conversation,
So
Meg.
good. That's so good. And the way that, working with deities, however we relate to them, right? Like,
Hmm.
some people will relate to deities as like literal entities in the world that we can have relationship with. Others will relate to them as metaphoric.
Hmm.
Others will relate to them as aspects of ourself that we're kind of projecting outward. Doesn't matter. However we relate, all of the above, something different. But building relationships with what those deities represent can be so enlightening for us. And one of the deities that really has helped me on around this material in particular is a Vedic goddess named Akilanda Vasheva, and she's the never not broken goddess. And her story includes her being shattered into a million pieces and then put back together, but put back together in a way in which the cracks are always there, always visible.
Wow.
And she rides on a crocodile, and she's like got this ability to like transcend the problems that are happening around her because she has become flexible in her brokenness. She's no longer afraid of breaking, and she's no longer afraid of not being whole because she's experienced herself as falling into a million pieces and still being herself, her whole self. And that connects with the Jewish concept of tikkun and this idea of
Oh, yeah.
God leaving cracks in things so that light can come through, and imperfection can highlight our humanity. And so there's this repeated theme in different cultures of the cracks, the broken places, and finding wholeness in that, almost this kind of trickstery energy of like finding our wholeness in the cracked places. And of course, in Japan, there's beautiful artistic practices around repairing broken pottery with
That's
gold.
what I was just thinking of.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. And so, yeah, the kintsugi practice of repairing pottery with gold, where that crack is not only, there, but it's highlighted and it's made part of the beauty and the character of the art, and it's very explicitly meant to reflect that internal experience of allowing our broken places to be part of our beauty and our uniqueness and our healing.
That is so beautiful. Gosh, really, truly. I know people are like, listen, you should listen to this episode twice. Listen twice and take notes. And, this also brings me around to another part of your work that I really wanted to talk about. The trauma informed Reiki. I just want to let everyone know again, they can visit your website, which is uh,
Insight.
Heartscapes Insight, yeah, .com, which the link will be down in the show description. But they can take that class on demand. Isn't
Yes.
that right? Yes. Okay. So we'll have the link for that down there. Now, there are other elements to your work I just want to highlight because I think it's of interest to so many of us. I recall a couple of years ago, I think, when you started holding the grief circles, which was very powerful and impactful. And you also on your site, people can sign up for maternity Reiki, which I had to ask you about because this is a question that I get so many times.
Yeah.
Like, can you do Reiki while you're pregnant too? And I personally had an experience with one of the podcast listeners. I got to work on her throughout her entire pregnancy. And
Mm.
she lived in New Jersey. And after she gave birth, it just so happened that she was coming to California for something. So I got to meet the baby and I felt like I already knew him. I know it was incredible. But anyway, could you talk a little bit about the maternity Reiki and about the grief circles that you facilitate?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the maternity Reiki to be perfectly honest, it's a branch of my practice that is less developed than I want it to be. For some reason, I've had a hard time kind of really opening up channels into to those spaces. There's been moments and there's an intention for it that I continue to hold and to nurture, and it's like I'm just being patient with it
Yeah.
coming to full fruition. But that began with a class that I took with another Reiki practitioner called Sacred Childbirth with Reiki. And the premise there that I felt really connected to was kind of what you're just describing, that if we look at the outcomes of practicing Reiki, remembering our true self, feeling grounded, spacious, and connected, embodying the precepts in the world. To me, that's a description of an enlightened and whole and healed world. And so if we can, the more people are actually living those things, not just talking about them, but really living them through whatever practice they have. Reiki is
Right.
but one. That's how I can impact the world, is by helping that to happen. And so the thought that raising a child in that environment, like raising them from the beginning, from the seed, in an environment that is making space for wholeness and groundedness and spaciousness and connection, etc. What kind of children would that be, right?
Right.
How would those people encounter the world and the challenges of the world? What kind of, could we be setting up a generation for much greater fluency in the sorts of mindsets and actions that are necessary to, I don't know, be a different kind of people, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any saving anything that is happening in this world, but to at least for whatever lifetime we have, be different in that.
Yeah.
So that premise was very fascinating to me. Again, connected to that social justice thread, right? Like what are really the conditions for creating that world that I asked my students to start imagining?
Yeah.
We have to be different.
Yeah.
We have to be different for the
Right.
world to be different. So what if that happened in utero? So I sought out this class. The class itself ended up being different than I thought. There were things about the way it was facilitated that I was uncomfortable with, so I didn't end up following that particular trajectory. But that concept stayed with me. And so I did develop just a very simple, structure for working with maternity in a couple of different capacities. So first, just in a straightforward way, come have sessions, help address some of the discomforts of the changing body, the pains and the things about pregnancy that can be challenging, and develop those qualities inside of yourself in subtle, easy to access ways. And then also an emphasis for people who want it on connecting with baby. And so, as we know, the practice of Joshin Kokyoho has us put our attention right in the womb, right in the place where the baby is. And so there became this really beautiful image in my mind of the baby who has not forgotten the wholeness of their true self. They're building the wholeness of their true self, right? We come out like we haven't forgotten yet. We have a lot to learn from an infant, right? Because they haven't forgotten yet. And so, this tiny little bright light, just clear and unencumbered and, shining right in that location where our own hara is expanding that light. Like there's just such a beautiful symmetry to that. So, guiding people through meditation that has them connect with their baby in that way. And, not only, using the imagination, using the focus to feel connected to that physical being that's growing, but to regard that being as a teacher, to regard that being as holding something that we can learn from,
Yeah.
right? So that aspect. And then occasionally I'll offer a class that essentially is a Reiki Foundations class that is geared towards using the basic practices within Reiki, primarily Joshin Kokyoho and precepts work, and then some guided touch to be with pregnancy, as a self-practice, and then also including partners or birthing partners to help give them some tools to support the pregnant person in that journey, including some tenahira, some touch. But more so really the how to be present
Yeah.
in that incredibly dynamic time.
Well, it's
Yeah.
so funny now listening to all that you do. And I have to say, when we met, however many years ago that was in Franz's class, there was just something about your personality, your spirit, everything about what your work represents. It just shines through even your personality. And I told you before, I was so thankful for your presence there. I absolutely loved connecting with you in that space. And I'm so thankful that we've stayed in touch throughout these years. But you're really doing so much beautiful work. So I want to tell everyone again to go to your website, of course, heartscapesinsight.com. And they can also follow you on Instagram. And what is the handle? I know there's a dot in
Facebook.
there.
I had to abandon Instagram because I
Okay.
couldn't make it work for me. But YouTube is the most active place.
Okay.
So Heartscapes Reiki on YouTube, and then I have a Facebook group for being in community around these things and sharing teaching and practice.
Yeah. And the Heartscapes Reiki on YouTube, I'm going to put the link for that as well below. Could you tell us about what you highlight on there? Because I know you do interviews, but just like you said before, you even have just teaching segments where you're giving
Yeah.
us some nuggets. Yeah. What is on
Yeah.
the page?
Yeah, I try to give myself a lot of latitude for what gets shared there. Firstly, because with being very ADHD minded, like if I need to be able to kind of go with whatever's calling my attention at a given moment,
Yeah.
but putting some structure around that. And so it's really I would say that the heart of what I'm trying to do there, and hopefully am doing there, is to explore the way in which the system of Reiki from its Japanese origins, like, so first of all, continuously reinforcing what those origins mean. What are the elements of Reiki from those origins? What did they mean? How do they apply to our life? How to take all of that and operationalize it in our life. What does it look like to sit with, just for today, I anger not, in a charged situation in our life? What does remembering the wholeness of our true self mean in a daily challenge or a daily joy that we're having, a question we're trying to answer? What is it? What does non-duality mean to me in my daily life, right?
Mhm.
What the heck does that mean and why should I care? So it's really that, like, exploring this incredibly juicy, amazing world of spiritual practice that has such deep roots and such deep connections to other traditions. And then coming back to the question, what does this have to do with my life?
Yeah.
How does this help me in my day to day? Because we're dealing with a lot in our day to day. We're
Yeah.
dealing with a lot of grief. So you mentioned that grief work, which was really just about holding space for grief to be present and to process it, and really asking what is our role as Reiki practitioners in
Yeah.
that, for ourselves and for others. What do these practices have to do with my day to day? And I feel like the more we can answer that question, the more actively we're going to actually practice. Because if we feel like we have to take time out from our life and remove ourselves from life and do our practice and then come back, it's of limited usefulness to us. We need to be able to access it right in the middle of whatever's happening so that we can be different in that moment than the way that we have before. My history was one of dissociation. I would check right the hell out when things were too stressful,
Yeah.
right? I would go right into the sky. So to have a practice with Reiki that starts with saying, hey, you need to get your roots in the ground. You need to start in your belly, you need to start in your hara, in your body, and you need to stay on the ground when things are hard and when the wind is kicked up. And once you can do that, then you can go into the sky and be spacious and open and imaginative and flitting, right? As long as you got your roots on the ground. But don't forget to connect. Don't forget that the whole point is so that we can feel connected to life. So remember to come there too. All right, that changed my life.
Oh, honey, 100%. I didn't even realize how much I wasn't in my body or how much I didn't want to be. Like I loved being out there. And it took a lot for me to really accept being grounded and to then appreciate it to the point where now I recognize when I'm not, and I got to bring myself right back into it. So, for some of us, it's a bit of adapting, you know, but once you recognize it, really, truly, it's life changing.
Yes.
It really is. So, there's one more thing you have coming up that I would love for everyone to know about. It's a very cool event. You have a summit that you are a part of coming up in November. Tell us about the summit and what you will be sharing.
So two summits in November, one with
Oh,
you,
yes,
the
yes,
Grace
yes.
Summit. They're both in November. Super excited about that. We've already
Mhm.
gotten to have that conversation. But the Reiki Business Summit it's a smaller live interactive event hosted by Christian Standing Stone of Standing Stone Healing, who is a delightful person. Find the Reiki Business Collective on Facebook and join this community. If you're not interested in being a Reiki business, he also has another community called Reiki Learning Group, which is more about just being in community around Reiki. But his mission is really, at least at this time, focused on supporting people in building Reiki businesses for all of the reasons we've talked about. It's a way to change the world,
Yeah.
and how to do that well, right? How to do that well so that we stay in integrity, that we're really providing high quality Reiki services, and that our businesses are successful
Right.
so that we can keep doing it. And so he's putting on the Reiki Business Summit. There's going to be a collection of speakers on different topics related to business. And I will get to speak about this world of trauma informed Reiki. So I'll be doing kind of a mini class, about an hour long, 45-minute long mini class, and then we'll have a live Q&A after that, and recordings available and all of the things. But I love that it's live and interactive, and it's a really cool lineup of topics, very diverse topics, including being seen in your Reiki business, right? One of the
Wow.
presenters is going to talk about the phenomenon that so many of us like are kind of introverted and kind of, we do this very intimate work. And then as a business owner, you gotta be visible, you gotta be
Yes.
seen. How to, like, again, do that in a way that feels authentic to us. So a lot of really good content that's gonna happen in that space.
That's incredible. So that's in November, but if we go to your website, there'll be a link for that as well.
That's a good reminder. I should put a link on my website.
Yes.
Yeah, right now it's just on Christian's website, Standing Stone Healings, but I will put a link on my website. Thanks for the reminder.
Yes,
Good
yes.
business
Okay,
practice.
so we can have a mini trauma informed Reiki class in this summit in November. And then we also have Michaela and I had another conversation, which you're going to love, for the Reiki Rays annual healing summit, which also will launch in the fall. So, yeah, a lot coming. You're a busy bee now.
Oh, girl, just trying to be in these streets making a living, you know what I'm saying?
Pollinating.
Not
Yeah.
always successful, but working
No,
on
it's a
it.
beautiful thing. And I really have to say, I mean, it's why I love these conversations so much because I think they're important. They're important for those of us who have been practicing for a while. They're important for those who are just new and for those who are curious, right? It's across the board. And it all comes back to community. That is one of the very interesting things about Reiki is that it tends to inspire so much community. There are
Yes.
several communities you can join. There is the community again of like being in classes and you create these friendships, these connections, these bonds. Um, I think community is a huge, huge part of Reiki and of itself and the umbrella. So I'm thankful that we get to be a part of each other's community and that you came to share with all of the Reiki Radio community. Yeah, all the things. We're going to have links below so that all of you can connect with Michaela, her work, her YouTube, the upcoming summits. And my love, also, I would love to put the link for the book that you mentioned, Let Your Life Speak.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'll send it
Yeah.
over.
Okay. So thank you so much for coming to have this conversation today, my love.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me back, and I
Yeah.
look forward to our next collab.
Yes, honey. Everyone, stay tuned for that. Thank you for being with us today.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Okay, beautiful alchemist. Thank you so much for joining me and Michaela today for this conversation about Reiki. Don't forget, if you want to learn more about Michaela and her work, visit her website, heartscapesinsight.com. The link to connect with Michaela is down below in the show description. And she also has a podcast called Reiki Crossroads and Connections, which you can listen to on your favorite podcast platform or also watch on YouTube. I have the link for that down in the show description as well. Thank you so much, Michaela, for coming to have this conversation with us today. And for all of you, thank you for tuning into Reiki Radio. As always, I really appreciate if you leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the show, or if you are watching on YouTube, be sure to follow the show and also like the video. It really helps the podcast, and I appreciate it so much. And then if you do want to join me for conversations about Reiki or even what comes up on the podcast, you can join me on Tuesdays in the Reiki chat discussions. The link to join the live Zooms is available on the Energetic Alchemist app. So you can download the app from the Apple App Store or also Google Play for Androids. And you can follow me on Instagram at Reiki Radio. I hope you all have an incredible week. I will see you very soon. Remember to always journey in love.